How's everybody? It is warmer at home than it is here, but not by too much for very long. So I left 60 degrees to come here, so you're welcome. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell you a small story. I actually grew up not terribly far from here, about 2 hours from here. Went to high school in South Peru, commuted like forever between 10,000 cornfields, do it every day. It was great. Moved before I graduated high school, I moved, but it was great. I loved it. So when Mel reached out to me to ask to come speak, I loved it a chance. So I was going to make a slide with the Chicago Tomster on it, but it had the socks, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. So we could do another one. I don't know. So anyways, so I'm sorry that I didn't include your Tomster, but please don't exclude me. You have a wolf Tomster. All right, so a little bit about me. If you don't know me, I'm on the Ember core team. I participate on a lot of the different teams that are going on, various strike teams, various sub teams, Ember Data, Ember CLI, fast food engines. I don't know what else is Octane strike team, various other strike teams, and mostly they invite me to the team meetings just because I make good jokes, and you'll see that as we get further in the talk. Probably, well, maybe. You know what? You tell me. So I have a fairly severe open source problem. In recent years, the last year or 2 years, I've been quite proud of my accomplishments to actually take time off. I highly recommend it. I have a good solid 2-week no activity streak going each year for 2 years straight, and I'm very happy. So, and I work at LinkedIn. I've been there for about 2 years. So coincidentally, hey, work-life balance, that's a thing you can do. That's great. Also, as an aside, I have to tell you, I took this picture a really long time ago. That was younger than me. This is older than me now. So it took me forever to get that selfie with those guys on my shoulder. Because every time you move to hold the camera, the things are falling off. You should appreciate this. All right, so before I get into any technical stuff, in all my talks I like to shout out to my family. They're at home, locking up the chickens right now, and taking care of the dogs and doing bedtime all by themselves, so I can be here. So always like to thank them and thank them for everything they do for me. Okay, so let's talk about additions. Look, I made 2 additions right there. Oh wait, I didn't do any really. No, anyways, so what is an addition? Has anybody like read up on all the details? Does anybody know anything? John, you don't count. All right, a few folks. All right, good. It's gonna be great because I only have time for really high level details, so it's gonna be perfect. One thing that you'll find out is that I enjoy heckling. So if you have a question, throw it out. It makes me feel right at home. All right, so before we get into like the details, like what are additions, what does that mean? Let's talk a little bit about what we've already got. We've already got various release channels. The first one is Canary. As you can tell from the Tomster bust, it is a little bit loopy, a little bit risky. It's where features land first. There is zero support, none. You can file issues, and then you can file PRs. That's how you get support. But really, it's where everything lands first. It's master. It's we try to keep it stable. We do deploy targets you can use in your app. If you were trying to test out a new feature, something just recently landed, or a bug fix perhaps, or something, it's totally possible to grab it. There's instructions on Ember.js.com/build. Tells you how to grab Canary or Beta or any of the other ones. But really, nobody's using this, or hopefully not many people are using this in their production apps. It will be problematic if you are. Okay, so Great. Features land first. When features land, they're feature flagged. They're like wrapped inside conditionals. They're disabled by default. You can opt in to enable them. So it gives you a way to opt into a new feature, test it out, do a test run in a demo app or something, and then throw it away. It's no risk, right? And that helps inform the process of the implementation, or maybe there's a bug or there's a problem, and then we can hopefully get that turned around in a second. So the next one is the beta branch, or release. So we do 6 weekly betas. We do betas weekly for 6 weeks. And the idea here is when we branch to a beta from master, we'll enable any features that were ready to go at the time. There may be none, there may be lots. It just depends on what's ready and what we think is stable at the time of the branch point. And then we'll do beta 1 through 6, and folks test it out. Many add-ons test them. It's easy to test it in your app if you're curious about how the next version of Ember is going to affect you. We love when app developers actually file bugs and issues and test things in beta because it helps us get a jump start on any of those bugs that might happen in require patch release. Reduces overall work and all that good stuff. But the idea here is this is where features go when they're more stable, they're sort of trickling out, and they're ready to go to the next step.
Wait, you should say that again. We super love when you try beta out and report bugs. It's the most incredible, helpful thing. And I've heard him swear that not enough people try to beta and found bugs.
I mean, the majority of the user base, I would say, are typically looking for very stable things. The only way they're going to get a stable thing is if they test it when it's not stable and tell us what's wrong.
Right.
So that is how stability happens, by screwing up a lot and fixing it. Right. Anyways, we try. All right, so then, of course, we do 6 weeks of betas, and then we go to a release. Release is the thing we do blog posts about. We got 3.7.0 is released, right? We usually, in the blog post, we'll talk about the things we landed, like the major highlight features, usually cross-link to either RFCs or inline docs or guides or whatever for the new features. Sometimes there's no features and it's just, this is just the next set of patches, bug fixes that trickle down. And so that's what release is. And then the last one is, we're gonna find the next slide at some point in the rest of the deck. You'll have to yell at me. It's an LTS track. So LTS, I don't have a slide. Pretend like you're seeing a really awesome bus of a very stable tom string. The LTS track is basically a thing where you have long-term support. It is 30 weeks. I need the slide. It's 30 weeks of bug fixes and 54 weeks of security fixes. That's like 5 JavaScript framework lifetimes. So it's really a long time. And it's a great thing. I think at any given time, we generally have 2 LTSs that are supported. One is in the sort of bug fix phase, and the other is in the security patch only phase. We only backport things to the LTS versions that are very stable. That's the point. If there's any risk at all, we're very risk averse. The whole goal is fixing things that are fundamentally broken. Maybe if a browser bug came out and was interacting poorly with 3.4, we might do a patch, stuff like that. But for the most part, if it's just a random edge case thing, it's probably not going to be backported very far because it has different risk requirements. Okay, so how do these things relate to Semper? They don't. So the short version is we only do major versions every couple of years so far. I'm certainly not boxing myself into a corner. If we want to do 5 majors next year, we will. That's the right thing. But generally speaking, major versions are a lot of work. I'm really lazy. So basically, the releases are just minor versions, and we keep incrementing and iterating forward, adding features, landing new things in the minor version, sounds good. So minor versions introduce new features, and the major versions don't introduce anything new. That is like a fundamental staple of how we do versioning. The point of the major version is to remove previously deprecated code. That's it. The only other, I say that's it, I say the caveat. The other caveat is if there's like a browser support being, like we dropped IE 9 and 10 when we did Ember 3, for example. Because it's not about deprecated features, it's not an Ember feature necessarily. Well, I guess it is, but the point is, it's not like APIs we removed or changed. It's just we're not transpiling, we're not dealing with the older legacy platform anymore. So, all right. So in the context of additions, why isn't all that enough? Sounds like a lot of work. I just talked about it for like 5 minutes, and seems like a ton, right? I think the point here is we miss, because we have dedicated to stability and long-term progressions in apps that have lived a long time. It means that we lose out on a major opportunity that other frameworks and other folks in the software industry use major versions for. And that is typically as big marketing releases, big features coming out, like massive changes in the way you think about the programming model. And that's what we're missing. We lack a time that we can talk about a concept, like a coherent group of things. And I think that's in my opinion, what editions are, right? So the basic gist is it's a new release type. It is completely unrelated to versioning, and it obviously will be declared at a given version, but it isn't about the version number per se. It's about the set of features. It's about the set of like basically coherence. So the docs, the guides, the API, the tutorials, all this stuff is going to talk about the new set of features together in one coherent set of features. Which to this point, when we're just doing those minor releases along, we add features. We try to do a great job. We try to make sure all the API docs have stuff. Sometimes we miss things, but for the most part, we do okay. But where in that cycle would you just rewrite the guides, talk about a new way of thinking? Like, it doesn't fit in that cycle. It doesn't really belong there. There's no easy place to like rally folks behind us and gather community support and push on features. Also, new features come out and they're inherently unstable until they've been vetted and the community's tested them. So we need a period of time where a feature's been out, like we know it's good, we're comfortable with it, we like it, it feels good to use and has good semantics. And then we're going to recommend everybody adopt it. This is just the way you teach the world. So that's basically the idea. So you're thinking, but what about some random thing? Feel free to shout it out. I just added a couple here. Version number, I already mentioned, it's not related to a version number at all. It isn't about version number. Once the edition is sort of labeled, it'll be that edition until we label another edition. So if Octane is the next edition, if it comes out and we label it at 3.20, it'll be Octane edition all the way until there's another edition, and that's it, right? And the whole point is, it's about the version, it's about the set of features that are in the edition. Yes?
Are there any other projects or products that have blazed this trail before?
Yes. So Rust has a similar process. I think they call it epochs, question mark, I think. I'm not for sure, but they have a similar thing. And roughly similar reasoning and constraints. So another thing that editions don't do is they don't introduce new features. The features have to have been landed in a version, and they already have to have been released and out there and stable and tested and used by folks. The other thing that I am slightly trolly, but the editions RFC is still not merged, but we are working on a new edition. So,
I have the answer to that.
Well,
I made notes today.
yeah, tell me.
Turns out, we introduced the idea of edition in the roadmap RFC and the roadmap blog post. So we are therefore okay to use the concept of edition. What we are using the editions RFC for is working on the process around edition. And we don't think that we want to close that RFC until we're sure like we've been through one of the processes.
Yeah, but it's still,
I know.
still funny. You ruined the joke. Yeah, so she's right. The point is we introduced the concept editions and pitched the first edition, and the way to think about it in the 2018 roadmap, I have some slides for that as well. Don't worry, it'll get its due. And then we have, and then we're still working and iterating on the actual edition's concrete language and what it does, it doesn't entail, and whatnot. I just find it very funny. And the annoying guy on the internet sort of way.
Was there anything in the past that sort of would fit the bill, that like an example of what was sort of an addition, or what
or an
maybe
example?
or like what something that was sort of an addition except in name, or that should have been maybe?
So so this is a bad example, an example of how to do it poorly, and that is the Ember 2.0 cycle. Ember 2.0 well, 1.13 and then 2.0 subsequently, because it was like the next one, introduced lots of new features, like the new way to write helpers was introduced, the adders and many new hooks like did render and all these things and components. Those were all introduced in 1.13, and then like stabilized in 2.0. But we did a really poor job. The docs and guides didn't explain it. Community, there was no coherence point. Like that's an example of how we did it badly and why we need a better process, a specific process. Yes.
That's I was last active around 1.13 2.0, and people are always asking about how to use routable components.
Yeah. It's a great question.
How do
If you find out, let me know.
Is there a cancel for that?
There is not an addition for that. No. So the rough. I will give you the 30-second version of routable components. That is that. It was a thing that depended on many other features landing. It should have been something like our additions concept, where it's an amalgamation of many features together to come out. We needed other things like being able to use native classes, not relying on some of the semantics of Ember.component and details. We'll get into some of that today, but the routable component as a concept needed to depend on those things, because we knew that the programming model that we had then, and still I guess today, wasn't great for that. So it would be kind of silly to develop new APIs depending on the old thing when we know it's not a good idea, right? But the real problem is that we did a poor job of explaining the situation with routable components. I think you could also talk about similar things with controllers. There's been other, I'm sure there's other partials, probably another example. Like there's lots of things where we've done a poor job of putting a stake in the sand and saying what we think of as the right way to do it or not, right? And I think the goal here is to avoid those mistakes again, right? And honestly put our best foot forward to give other folks that maybe looked at Ember back then and discarded it because look at this archaic object model, and not really trying to figure out why we had our own thing. And like, hey, let's look at it again. This is the new thing. People are excited. Let's talk about it. Let's do this thing. Let's look at it, right? So that's the idea. Great questions, though. Okay, Octane. Anybody know why this name was picked?
Cool. Race cars.
Yeah, okay, sure. But Ember's already fast enough. Yeah, I don't know either. I was hoping one year. All right, so this RFC sets the Ember 2018 roadmap. That's what the title of the RFC 364 said. It was proposed in August of 2018 and merged in November. Now, I don't know about you, but it didn't have a lot of runway in 2018 to actually do anything. So, anyways, I digress. Yes. So, anyways, so the RFC, this RFC set out a bunch of stuff, lots of great stuff. So there was a couple of major sections, and I totally encourage folks that are curious about it to go and read through it. It's really good, and the prose makes my trolling not effective. So I was relying on the fact that you hadn't actually read it so that I could still troll. But the basic gist is there's two main sections. There's the finish what we started section, things that we've talked about, things that we've been sort of working on along for many, many years. And then there's another section. So, but in the finish what we started section, we've got this list. The first one here is Broccoli 2.0. In Broccoli 2, the whole idea, for those of you that don't know, Ember CLI internally uses Broccoli as a build system. And many add-ons hook into the Broccoli pipeline and augment things and tweak things and work on different layers of it. The idea of Broccoli, I think, is great. The exact details are not always great, but the idea is great. It's just it's akin to like an onion file system. Everything is you take an input and you're expected to emit an output, and there you go. There's how you do your pipeline. Broccoli 2.0 introduced a bunch of neat stuff. It integrated a watcher with the builder environment, and that lets us do really neat optimizations around when to rebuild individual sections. So prior to those changes being integrated, we had to rebuild the entire graph of the build pipeline every time without fail, because we had no way to know the side effect here would affect the file over there, because it was very abstracted. It was just a pipeline. You could read files from anywhere and emit them in your own output. So that's one thing it did. Another thing it did was it moved the temp directory, which is up until then in the project root, like in TMP folder in your project, out to the system temp directory. And there was much rejoicing. The main issue was with editors indexing the temp directory repeatedly. Yes, you could do special editor config to do it, but once you're there, you're already lost. So if you need custom editor configuration just to make it work, yeah, good luck. So that's not good. Okay, so new file layout. I prefer to call it this. Lots of other people call it module unification. I think that as a term is bananas because it assumes you know all the things it's unifying, which nobody does. So good luck. Anyways, it's a new file layout. It changes the way your files sit on disk. It puts them in an SRC folder. The individual things that are related together are co-located. So they're like your route and your routes template are in the same folder. Oh my goodness. There's also a way to have components that render other components that aren't modifying the global list of components that are available to you folks. We called it, in this original RC, we called that local lookup. It's likely to be implemented slightly differently, but the point is you had different ways to pull in things into your scope and use them just within a little subsection, little sub part of the tree of your app. I think that's really good. This particular point, I feel like we've been working on this for a long time. Lots and lots of effort's gone in. It actually works for the app level. Yes.
Better pods thing.
Yes. Pods is one of the things being unified. So the short version is pods won. Everyone else just needs a second. So pods are the best. But anyways, the idea is it's the same. It's the same but different. So the co-location is the same. The folder structure is different though. Like your components, for example, are in source UI components, not app components or something. But wherever you can put it in pods, right? There's also much less configurability. You can't control individual folder for different types. So the system at build time actually can know statically that a given file is a certain type of thing, and that's really important for some of the optimizations we're running. Yes.
Does that mean that file layout is required, as opposed to pods are sort of required or not required?
So pods were never required, as far as I know.
But you turn it on or not?
You can turn it on or off. Yeah, you can turn it on or not. You can use Octane or not. It's up to you.
So it is required.
I think there's still an RFC to be written here. The original proposal, yes, was absolutely very, very concrete and what was required and what was not required. There's some active work in our new RFCs around allowing you to directly import in templates, for example, so that the dynamism of the way things are resolved is a little bit less, but it feels much more concrete. You know where to go to look for things. your editor integrations can work better, things like that. And in that world, we don't need to be as strict about where everything goes. Now, I still think we will strongly suggest specific places for things because that's what makes it good to go between Ember apps, like one app to the other, and it'll be the same. Whereas if you go in any other arbitrary framework, it's often however that team decided to cobble it together, it might be a little different each place. So we don't want to lose it. That's really important. But it's also very important that there's a difference between the requirements of the system and the best practices of the system, right? So from a fundamental requirements perspective, I would suggest that we probably have very few of them, right? We have few specific requirements, but there'll be like linting, or there'll be some warnings, something will be a little bit naggy, a little bit annoying if you do the wrong thing. Because oftentimes the wrong thing means you've made a mistake, not that you're consciously choosing to do the thing. So, did I see a hand? No, okay, sorry. Hand.
Code nod?
There is a code nod, yes, thank you for asking. Way back in the day when this RC was first being written, I found it literally impossible to reason about the arbitrary folder structure that was being discussed. I can't keep that all in my head at once. I need to actually open a project in my editor and navigate things and find things and do fuzzy file finding and see what the tab titles are. I needed that. So I wrote a migrator, Ember module migrator, I think is what it's called. But yeah, there's a migrator that existed. The migrator existed way before any implementation was done. It literally just moved the files into the locations, and it was totally broken, didn't do anything, didn't work at all. But it put them in a place that the specs said they should be, so you could open it up in your editor. You could like navigate the files. You could, you could use the one true editor and actually find things. Let me solve for what that was. Yes.
In the file layout, is the CSS also scoped to component? So like, because you say that you have private components that are not global.
Yep. So the question is whether CSS is also included in the sort of layout. The short answer is no. The line answer is yes. So the spec is very the original RC was somewhat loose about it because we just hadn't we still hadn't like the styles aren't like a solved thing, right? Every app still to some extent wants to do its own way in certain aspects. Some might want to use shadow, some don't. Like they don't want risky stuff. Like that's risky. Sorry, strike that. Never mind. I didn't say that. Anyways, so I think in my opinion, yes, absolutely. You want your tests there. You want your styles there. You want anything that's collocated with that thing there. That might even include assets. It might include images that you use in that thing's template, and it should just work. And I like that. I think that's great. I think the current implementation that exists in EmberCLI that does the build for this supports having SAS or arbitrary files in that directory that are other types, but it does not doesn't do anything special with it. It's up to like EmberCLI SAS or Ember CSS modules or something that does, because we don't build the SAS or CSS, SCS, whatever thing it is. We don't really do much with that out of the box anyways. So I think we don't do anything intelligent with it by default. So that's why it's no. We don't really do anything. But the intent is that you would absolutely be able to do that. My little pet thing that I like looking at is CSS blocks. But there's lots of different things, and I think that it's absolutely pretty important. And again, the RFC also mentions but doesn't go into detail. But I think tests should also be co-located, and the migrator does that for you actually. Because I think having the test right next to the component or whatever in the same directory is great, and you should too. All right, number components, quote unquote. Say to be as fast. So trust me. Native BS classes. Okay, so classes are great. Classes are possibly, so someone argued with me not the other day, it's been a while now. Someone argued with me and said, classes are the best things in JavaScript since like ES5. They're totally wrong, but I understand how they got deceived. Async await is obviously the best thing. But anyways, classes you can write and just look ugly, right? Async await, like, it was nightmare. Anyways, so classes are great. The Ember object model existed because classes weren't a thing. We had to invent all of this stuff. We built on what was there in ES3. Like lots of things like mixins, you see, they still aren't in native classes because the community hasn't really come to any sort of consensus. Maybe they'll have mixins in classes eventually. Maybe they won't. But it's not our problem. So yeah, mixins, whatever. So I think I have some slides here showing what that looks like. Nope, really don't. So anyways, there'll be other slides for the classes. The point is, you just would have service instead of service.extend, you just say class myService extends, and it just works. And that's awesome. And it interopts well with the current object-based classes. There are very few caveats. There are a handful of caveats. Like for example, the constructor may not be exactly the thing you think it is. For example, in current release 3.7, it's probably more likely that you actually want to implement init, not constructor. Constructor doesn't get access to the args, has to create, for example. So yeah, probably you want to use init. Okay, and then the last one here on this list is seamless ES module usage. It's a little bit of a mouthful. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but having to write an Ember moment and an Ember Lodash and an Ember every other damn package that's on NPM is very frustrating and annoying, and it should just work. You should just be able to import from Lodash.js and get it, and it should be a thing. That's what that's about. You can get this today. Actually, all of the things here you can use today, and they work. They just are not as well documented, not as well polished as we want them to be. That's what the edition is all about. But the module usage is really well provided by Ember Auto Import as an add-on. And you can use it at multiple layers. You can have add-ons that use it, your app uses it, it does the right thing. It also supports dynamic imports. So it's quite nice. Okay, so then there's this other list of features that are not finished what we started, and some duplicates, as you can see. I don't know why that had to be, but whatever. And these are like, so removing jQuery by default. Now this is a thing that we previously had an RFC for. We made it a big priority to make sure that we worked when jQuery wasn't in the build. jQuery is, I don't know, something 30-something K. I mean, you can build a custom build or something, but it's not small. Yes? All the tests, yes. And that's been true. So tests, the question was whether that includes testing. It does. It also includes Ember's own tests, which was actually the harder lift. It was much easier to make act tests work because they weren't 5 years old. So the test harness supports both the test harness that we released in Ember 3.0, like setup rendering test, setup application test, that style test. Also has a this.element in it that you would use instead of this.dollar. All types of tests have this.elements. Even an application test, you just have the root element. It may not be useful to you, but it is there. It all works without jQuery and is tested without jQuery. So the Ember Test Helper suite, the Ember Qnit suite, both run both with and without jQuery for the current release version of Ember. And that's like a cron job we do. So that's great. Native classes, duplicate. Glimmer components, duplicate. Remove run, Ember.run from dev mindset. Now, this is my paraphrasing a little bit of the RFC here, but the rough TLDR here is that you shouldn't have to think about whether you're in an auto run or whether you wrap the thing in Ember.run or if you have scheduled something or whatever. You shouldn't see these really, really frustrating assertions in your tests. You did such and such, but you forgot you're in an auto run in tests and go to hell. That's gone. So that is gone. As of Ember 3.4, that assertion is literally gone. The only holdover here, in this case, is that there are still cases where we force flush asynchronous render, which is in tests, which is never a thing you can actually do in production code. Well, it's never a thing you should do in production code. I suppose you could force it to do anything. So we're going to have another RFC to work on that. But the rough gist is if you've ever written in a rendering test that did this.set some value, and then immediately after that, without a settledness check or anything, you check for the DOM, you're assuming that it synchronously renders the thing, which is never a pathway that happens in production. And so the new work that we did in the test was all about making the test more like reality, more like production. So this was the one last sort of bastion of issue. There'll be an RFC for that coming up.
Wait.
Yes. Oh man, I haven't pulled those yet.
That's tweet Otis funny features. There you go.
I'm changing order. Man, I suck at slides, guys. All right, hey, this is the I told you there's going to be examples. So this is a native class, right? So in this case, we went from just a random service.extend with a method in it, and then this is the class version. Now you're saying, well, that's a little bit more code. That's longer. Why is it longer? First of all, don't be haters. Secondly, because we got to name the thing, so we get to give it a name, awesome service. And you know what? You can choose not to do that, but shame on you. So if you name it, then in your dev tools, in your debugging session, it will say your name, which is really awesome. It makes it much nicer to debug and figure out stuff. You'll get a stack trace. It'll have the right name associated with the method. It's quite nice. The other thing, I am a little on the fence about whether you should include the type as well in the name. Jury's still out, in my opinion, but you can imagine if you had a controller and a route with the same name, it'd be a little bit annoying to have two things called like host or something. So I can see the argument, but anyways, I used it for an example. A coworker of mine wrote an awesome blog post recently about using native classes. You should totally read about it. It's on the Ember.js blog. And awesome. Okay, so Glimmer components. I told you I was going to come back to it. So let's talk a little bit about Ember.component first. So you probably don't all know how complicated Ember.component is, but it's really complicated. There's a lot of stuff. There's 13 lifecycle hooks, 29 event handler methods that you can implement, and then we have to listen for all automatically whether you implement them or not. So we have to set up all these 29 event handlers all the time, regardless, which is a little bit silly. 9 different customization properties for elements, like tag name, attribute binding, class name bindings, whatever, I don't know, 9 of them. And then 21 different framework functions and hooks that you could, not hooks, functions that were there. This was things like this.get, this.set, this.get properties, set properties, like there's a whole list, 21 of them. The API of this component is pretty massive. And it sort of grew over time. It exploded in the 113 cycle where we added a bunch of these lifecycle hooks because we realized that people needed more than just an insert element in some cases. But the real thing that it shows is that there just wasn't a clear, obvious way that you should have done in all the things, right? So we just had to keep adding methods, adding different hooks, adding different ways to do stuff, and it shows in the API. The API is very complicated. If you tell me Ember is hard, I'll point you to this slide. So yes, it's hard to remember all these things. I do this a lot, and it's still hard for me to remember which of the hooks fire in which circumstances and with which args and before or after subchildren or all those things. It's hard to remember. Let's imagine it's even harder to document, probably. Okay, so that being said, this is the interface, the full interface for Glimmer component. Now, I said air quotes before because Glimmer component at the time the RFC was written was a nebulous conceptual thing and not a literal thing because they weren't actually talking about the thing that was implemented in Glimmer.js at the time. This is an iteration on that. I think it's good, but it's an iteration. You notice the majority of the properties here are related to dealing with destroying and destruction. And the reason for that is mostly compatibility with existing tooling, like Ember concurrency, like Ember lifeline. It's quite important for those things to be able to know how to know up when the object is being destroyed. It's totally possible that in some future we make a general purpose utility for lifeline entanglement that would let us remove some of these. But for now, it's still pretty simple interface. Unlike Ember component, the things passed to you when you're invoked aren't just splattered out onto your this context. They're passed to you in a bucket called args. The constructor gets both an owner and the args, and you can set up the eye. You can do whatever you need in your fields. It's quite nice. I have some examples here as well. But one thing I wanted to point out, one thing you don't see is you see no lifecycle hooks for DOM, none. That's on purpose. That's a good thing. So, all right, so let's just take a simple component that had a computed property where you're pulling on these first last. Also, how about that native getter feature, right? Like, you don't have to do this that get all the time. Anyways, that's great. All right, and then you can transform that into this. Now, I haven't talked about track. I don't talk about it in depth in this talk, just for lack of time. But the idea is you mark the things that are the leaves in your the leaves, I guess, in the system as tracked, and any computation that uses those leaves would know to invalidate when they're updated, right? You can think of it like computed, but you don't have to specify manually here done in name that your access, what your access is, right? We figure it out by what is looked up during the getter, which is quite nice. Yes. Yes.
But if there's a conditional in that getter,
so every time we run the getter, so the question is if there's a conditional in the getter and something, are we going to lose tracking of the things that are in the other condition? Okay, so the first time it's invoked, it won't know to track things not in the condition it went down. It couldn't know, never ran the code, right? But it did know to check the predicate, right? It knows to check the condition. So if the condition changes, it'll update, right? And then it'll catch the thing the next time. So it's not set in stone. It's not based on the first time you run it, we do some extra work, and then later do something else. Every time we do the getter, we say, okay, imagine it's like a stack, and we say, starting to look up a property now, and then we just track everything that was looked for in that time until we're done. And that's what invalidates it, essentially. Anything that we pull on that was tracked from any object, it could be a service, it could be a third-party thing, it could be anything that's tracked, a model or something. It's not on the component itself, and it's still going to invalidate. It's still going to properly rewrite. Okay, so hey, if you want the Ember.component API, this is what you're gonna write. Plus like 30 more lines of attribute bindings and class name bindings and a bunch of inline conditionals. But you can do it. So this is a little trolling. This is the first slide with actual DOM, I think. But the point I'm making here is that the templates in Ember components are outer HTML. So you actually write your root element directly in the template. So unlike Ember.component, where it gives you a div by default, and you see tag name and customize it and all that jazz, you just put it in your template. We don't need to develop a JavaScript API to define DOM. We actually have templates, and that's what they're good at. So let's do that. So in this case, it gives you some nice things. First of all, it means that you no longer have to deal with bizarre cases of concatenation and whatnot because of the quotedness here. This is the first look at some other element modifiers. I'll get into more detail on the element modifiers, but the idea here is that did insert and will destroy are element modifiers. They're similar to, they go in the same space as action would today, and they get past the element, and they're allowed to set things up and when the element is created. So what's happening here is on this div being inserted into the DOM, it's calling this div insert element method. That's it. And then on destruction in the DOM, it's calling will destroy element method. It really is an analog to the Ember.component lifecycle of those two hooks, barring all the other hooks like did render, did update, all those would have to be called as well. All right, so there's some other features that aren't really listed in the RFC. Yes?
what is the parity between Glimmer and Octane?
Glimmer and, say again, sorry.
Glimmer and Octane, and then the actual Glimmer library.
So there is no direct relationship. Glimmer is a subset of component features that, like the rendering engine that Ember uses, right? Ember Octane is an addition, and it encompasses a set of features. So there is a relationship, I guess, is what I'm saying, but it's not really terribly important. The thing that is the reason why the base component class doesn't come, at least in the current RFC, comes from @Glimmer, is so that you can actually develop something for both Ember.js apps and Ember apps and have it be portable amongst the two. That was important in the design phase of the thing. Whether people do it or not is up to them, but it was important from a design perspective to be able to say, hey, I have this generic library of Glimmer components, and you can use them either between Ember or Glimmer.js. So does that clear up the? All right, so these features are things that aren't listed in the RFC, the 2018 roadmap RFC, but are fundamentally required for one of the other features. I think all of these are fundamentally required for Glimmer component and to make it work well. But so we'll dig into some examples. So looking at named args. So in this example, you're invoking show post component. You pass post. This thing is a named argument, and then inside show post, you can use it as @post, and it'll just work. When you see @post like this in a template, you know for sure that the backing JavaScript or TypeScript of this component doesn't mutate to do anything with post. It's coming directly from the invocation. It's directly passed in and used. You know that the JS TS can't modify. I think that's pretty important. So there I have a couple more examples. I don't have a couple more examples. Actually, it's with angle bracket invocation. Okay, so continue.
Quick question.
Yes.
Should I back up the slide? Yeah, maybe go back to the.
One too many.
So instead of @post, what if you would do this @post?
Yeah. So this @post, great question. So I was making it clear that if you see @post, it means whatever was passed here directly. It's literally the same reference as this is used right there. If you use this @post, it's going to say, give me the post property from my backing context. So this @post could be modified in the component. You could have a computed property. You could have a getter. You could mutate it in your constructor or in it or whatever, right? So seeing this @post is also a signal that says, hey, go look at the JavaScript for this value, right? And that's also why there's a lint that will be enabled by default and part of Octane that will actually strongly suggest that you either use named arguments or this dot property name instead of curly post in this case. And the reason for that is that you know by reading the template, all of the usages are either lexical, like it's either a block parameter directly in the template above where you are, or you know it comes directly from the call site, or it comes from your backing component. You don't have to go on this like multiple fallback level mental lookup thing. It's that no one can understand. Yes.
Is the for like adder?
Yes, you can think of it like that. Okay. And indeed, internally, we literally transform adders.post to @post.
Is the for like argument?
No. Though I think in retrospect, it's a little bit unfortunate that so many things ended up being exposed in the 113 cycle that didn't really go through the RFC process the same way as we do with like modern designs. Because I think this.adders and adders in the template were not fully fleshed out, not fully thought through. And then that made us go to a different name when maybe it would have been fine. I think in retrospect, it's good because it is useful. I'll talk about another feature in a moment. It's useful to actually differentiate arguments from attributes. The attributes are an actual thing in the DOM, and arguments aren't. So it's useful to be able to call this something, this post thing, something different than if I have a div and it's got properties, or attributes, not properties. I know the difference, I promise. Okay, element modifiers. Here we go. This is the best element modifier ever. I don't know why you would ever do this, but this is an example in the element modifier RFC. Element modifiers are a thing that you can write. They have a couple of hooks that are called on them, and mostly it's about when this thing is inserted into the DOM, do some work, like call a function, and it can do stuff. In this case, I have a sample implementation of this. It literally just calls performance with the first argument as the method name, and then the second argument as the thing to pass it. But you can do almost anything. You could write bind adder all over again if you really wanted to. You want to take cache args and split it out as attributes. You can totally do it. Someone wrote a really awesome on element modifier, which just directly uses add event listener instead of using the Ember event dispatcher, for example. Like, some really nice things that you can do there. The reason this is important is that this lets you directly target the piece of DOM that you care about. No more this.dollar, whatever, some selector in your did this element to go find the element you cared about. You just directly put the element modifier on the one that you care about, and you have access to the element directly. And generally speaking, the API for creating modifiers is not terribly ergonomic right now, but it's okay. And we plan to continue RFCs making it like userland modifiers much nicer. It's totally public API, it's safe to use, it's just not pretty when you roll through them. But we tend to think that there'll be less of them than like you would see custom helpers and stuff. But you know, jury's still out, I guess. Okay. Let's see more examples. All right, so this is the thing I showed before. This I call is an argument, a named argument, because it's essentially like we used to call them hash args, but it's a named argument. These two invocations are exactly the same from the call, the show post side. It would not know the difference between those two invocations, and that's pretty important. It means that you can author components the same way you always have, and they just work, and you don't have to care about the call site. The nice things about this angle bracket invocation, though, is because you're not in curlies, you can do things like concatenation, you can do things like conditionals, you can have modifiers in here, like if you want something to run, maybe some tracking thing to run when a component renders its element, you can do that now, right? That composability, it's a whole other level of composability that we just don't have today. So the other thing, I think I have an example of it next. No, this is just showing concat. So in a curly invocation, you'd have to use a concat helper to do this. Simple, like take a first name, a space, and a last name. But in angle bracket invocation, you can just use, like, you just write it out where you want to. It's kind of nice. Okay, so this is another case. This is what I was talking about. This is actually going to set an attribute on the element inside show post that is marked as not valid attributes. And so the root element, basically, wherever they decide to put it. And the idea here is that you can pass it both arguments, and the arguments get passed to the component. The component's JavaScript can do whatever it wants. It can, you know, use your value and then default to something else. It can do all sorts of things. It can do whatever it wants. But the attributes, it never has access to. It doesn't see them. It's not passed to it. It can't mutate it. Can't mess with it. Can't do anything with it. They're just splattered out onto the element that you have, the component has marked as dot attributes, like the place to put attributes. So this is actually really important. If anybody has developed an API in Ember.component land, and especially like in like generic form utility component or something, and then gotten a pull request to add some other entry to the attribute bindings, and then another pull request, and then like 30 more pull requests, and you end up with like a 2-page downs of attribute bindings in your component when you go through it in your editor, because you had to literally list every possible attribute that anyone that was consuming you might ever want to use. That's horrible. And this works around it. This avoids that by just letting you take arbitrary attributes, putting them on your element, and it just works. That's it. All up.
What is the track annotation or whatever they call that? Work with you know, collections, and when you want to sort of, you know, changes to elements in an array or whatever.
So you're saying if you're tracking an array and
like right now we do dot, you know,
do push object or something, and you use dot brackets square root.
Right. I'm just wondering what the syntax is.
I think in general, the simplest thing to do would be to return an array, like the spread like mechanism, you know, where you just do like spread out than you think. That's commonly done in other frameworks. I'm not sure it's actually a great answer. It's just really common. I don't know. Sorry. It is addressed in the RFC. I just don't remember the details. Sorry. Yes.
Can you explain the element modifiers a little bit better or more?
I can do it more. Whether it's better, that is up to you.
I think I got it.
So the idea is any arbitrary element in your template, you want to run JavaScript code when it's inserted or destroyed or an argument updates, right? Just assume you did, right? Previously, if you cared about that case, like if you had a component that when it's inserted in its insert element, you have to check and like set up some jQuery element, or some jQuery widget or something, or maybe a date picker or something like that. If you did that, you would have to, assuming it wasn't your root element, you'd have to go in your insert element, you'd have to go find the element you care about, like do some selector, whether it's this $, or this element.query selector, whichever mechanism. You have to go get it, and then you have to set stuff up, right? Well, what happens if that thing is inside a condition? You just leaked the jQuery widget in your component, and you probably didn't think about it because it's all the time. It happens all the time. I don't mean you. I'm just like it's a very common pattern. So it's better. So we think that it's better to be able to describe those common things directly on the DOM element that you actually care about, and you can have it call your function back on the component, or you can have a helper, or you can have anything. It could be autofocus, like focus on insert or something. That's a common thing people do as well, right? And it doesn't even need to do anything with the component. It just executes some arbitrary code, right? So the idea is when the div, when the thing it's in, gets inserted, a callback is called. You can do, it gets past the element, it gets past the arguments, both positional and named, like the hash args. And it can do whatever it wants to the element. It does not, it can like set attribute, it could add event listener, it could add the element to a weak map and use it for later for some other random thing. It could do lots of things, right? Maybe it's recycling non-elements, who knows? It could do an almost infinite number of things. And the inverse of that, like the opposite of that in the Ember API was you had to do this imperative code in your JS. And because you could do conditionals in the template, you would have no way to know if you were doing the jQuery widget setup case and it was inside an if in your template. If that if goes from true to false, you don't have anything in the JavaScript side that's going to run when to tear that down. There's no way to do it. You have to do it in your own will destroy element, and it may or may not be present. You have to write some really annoying code, right? So with element modifiers, the template is basically this sort of master, right? Like the template saying, when this thing is inserted or when this thing is destroyed, do this thing. Go do this code.
So you're moving all of the lifecycle hooks from Octane.js.
Yeah, in Glimmer components, there are no lifecycle hooks, right? And the reason for that is because, well, there's two reasons. First of all, there were too many, and they were roughly impossible to reason about. And secondly, oftentimes when you have the hooks called, you actually care about some sub-component, some subset of the actual template. And it's just easier to target the thing you care about directly instead of sort of imperatively or whatever in the component jets.
The examples are missing, so let's think about root element. And then Sunes's stuff, you can call those element modifiers on an internal HTML.
Yes, any element in your template.
And so you could, like the example element.
They were obviously trivial examples.
You have like, if, they need to select an end date, show a date picker. If select, they need to show an end date, goes false, like that'll stop being rendered, but the code you registered, if it was in the JavaScript, like still lives, and now you leak memory or are going to have an error on data run or whatever. But if you're like invoking it on the HTML, when that DOM element gets ripped out, it's known and can.
Yeah, the system can tear it down properly. The RFC does have a motivation section. It should hopefully motivate itself better than I can probably in a few minutes. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention, I think everything I talked about can work today back to Ember 3.4 with combinations of polyfills and things that we've written that work going back. I think 2.12 is how far.
I had a question about debugging in the inspector for these element modifiers.
Shoot.
now that you can put through your template code onto
Yep.
elements on the page, you can really do
Yep.
more in an inspectable way. Is
Yep.
the inspector going to update, like, will they be part of the component
So we're still working on inspector integrations stuff. Robert Wagner and myself and Teddy Casey have been chatting through some various things. The basic gist, the answer is yes. We're going to do something. It's not exactly clear what the design is yet. The spitball is in the components tab in the inspector. You would actually be able to see the actual template similar to the DOM tab, and you could see the arguments that were passed. You could see the modifier that was passed. Probably we could make it so you get a breakpoint, but that's not necessarily easy. But yes, it's a very real problem because today you just like $E on the component, you know all the JS is there, so you just like dig into it and look at it, play with it, like rerun the function or whatever. Whereas that's not true if it's just like the VM is doing random things and you don't know when it's happening. Yeah, so it's totally a thing. The other thing that we have, there's a few pieces about the inspector that have to be fixed and not fixed, made to work well with Octane stuff. Things like right now, if you use the inspector and you use angle bracket invocation, we still show it to you as if you had done curlies, because there's no, because we made it completely opaque to the callee, like there's just no way to know if you invoked it with angles or curly brackets. And I think it's a good design, but it's a little unfortunate for debugging. So we're still working through some debugging APIs specifically for those things. The other thing you lose is when you have custom components like Glimmer component, notice there was no debug container key in there, which for those of you that have ever had to deal with it, that's how you see the name of the thing as looked up by the DI system. So that means that Glimmer components don't even know their own name, which is like fine. Most of the time nobody cares, but sometimes you do. Like if you're the inspector, you want to show what component you're in. Yes.
You mentioned the Ember.js framework. Like what's the role of it today
Good question.
in the Ember ecosystem?
So I can give you my smartass answer, and then I can tell you what I think will happen. My smartass answer is that I think it was a great experiment. I think it is excellent to be able to write things that are very small and can very nicely and handily target mobile and hit performance numbers that are needed there. But I want to make Ember just do that by default. There's no reason that we can't, and that's what we're going to do. The thing that we'll probably end up doing is we'll continue having the two things, like as people have effort and energy to work on it. Right now, most of the effort we've got is going into Octane, because we've been a while on, let's add new features to Glimmer. Let's talk about cool, like, ahead of time compilation and WASM and all this stuff. It's time to bring that home to roost. We've done all the work. We need to get it back in the thing that actually pays our paychecks. So that's why a lot of the effort's going into Ember and Octane and bringing all that stuff home. I think basically what we'll end up seeing is Glimmer.js will iterate along with these new features. Like for example, the Glimmer component API that I showed, that is not the API that Ember.js has today. Like it has a couple of hooks, and I want to say it has like some mechanism to access DOM, which, as you notice, we didn't have that. So there's some syncing, resync that has to happen after the iteration of the RFC cycle and stuff. So I believe that that's all going to happen, and we're going to keep pushing that forward. We still absolutely have users and use cases where Glimmer.js is still the right choice. But I'm hopeful that we can reduce that even more. Right? We can make it so that generating a new Ember app and building it out of the box doesn't need to be more heavy than Glimmer.js app. There's no reason for it. We can fix it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Has it did it have any traction on it? Because I never heard about this. That's why.
Well, how do you define traction?
Applications.
There are applications that use it in production, yes, at pretty decent scale. So the issue is just time, divisional labor, that kind of stuff, right? So if there were more people using it, there'd be more people contributing to it, and it'd be easier, right? And often, a lot of the folks that I'm aware of that are using it can't contribute the same way that others can. Like the requirements and restrictions of what they're allowed to do. But if it's something you care about or are interested in, you should totally chime in. There's a Discord channel for it, and like Ember.js. I don't know. There's a channel, and you know, we'd love help. Like there are no end of ideas. There's just lack of time to implement. So if there's more willing people that want to implement stuff, chime in. Yes.
Or fall back for decorators.
Great question. Thank you, Trent. So for those so the question was, is there a fallback for decorators? Yes, it is falling backwards directly under our sword. No, seriously. So I think the shorter answer is nothing changes for us right now. There's still a very, very large community of people using decorators. And it's still very much in our interest to use decorators as a broader community than just Ember. I personally am not interested in making a sort of subset feature thing. Now that maybe what we end up having to do to like de-scope risk in the meantime, but I personally think the thing that would be the right path forward is that we would work together with other communities. You know, the React, Angular, MobX, you know, TypeScript, other communities that are also already using decorators, similar to the process that went into Promises A+, right? Like that was, it's been a while now, but it was a similar thing, right? Like it was very much a user-land spec. It was much, in my opinion, it was much easier to do with Promises because it was an API, not a syntax, but it's a similar thing, right? So the decorators RFC that we already merged, said specifically that if TC39 did not advance to stage 3, this past, I guess last week it was, whenever it was, recently, that we would have another RFC to answer that exact question. But again, I suspect the answer is, we stay the course, we do what we're doing. We just have to figure out how to pin the support of the syntax to something that we can rev as needed when the syntax changes. So maybe that means Ember CLI Babel brings decorator support, and you just have the new major versions when different versions of decorators come out. Something like that. A little hand wavy on the details, but that's what I think is probably right. No.
So yeah, Tom Dale's meeting with the Angular team next week, and we should have a new RFC by the goal is a week.
RFC to Ember?
Ember, yeah.
To Ember to
So the last RFC in Ember said specifically, if it doesn't advance, like we're assuming it will advance. If it doesn't, then we'll have to circle back around to sort of assuage any concerns and risk. So, and like it is possible that while we support decorators and will support them, it may be possible that apps will decide not to opt into them. But that means they don't get to opt into some native class features because it's fundamentally not possible to offer native classes with all the things that you might want, like tracked, computed. You can't, there's no pretty syntax. You would have to like essentially have a thing that you would decorate it after the class body. You'd call like some utility method, like class.prototype, pass in the class prototype and the name of it, like object defined property. That would be what I would think of. Yes.
I remember there was a branch of Ember CLI that did tree shaking.
Yes.
Do you have any updates on how far along that is?
Yeah, so that is also part of Octane, but I believe that it probably will end up being a little bit separated. There's a bunch of work that different groups did I don't know if it was in parallel, but like independently of each other. There's some stuff that did land in Ember CLI, the other stuff that is being worked on independently. And I think the short answer is it's a highly important feature, and we're working on it actively. Like it's a thing that I'm checking in with and working with the folks on it weekly at least. So simple apps are working. Not simple, smaller apps are working, and they work fine. Like Travis Web, for example, boots and does the right thing. Due to the fact of how we do DI, it doesn't actually shake out very many parts of Ember itself, but it does shake out quite a lot from add-ons like Lodash or something. If you're using one or two functions, you'll have to bring one or two instead of like the whole Modash. But right now, Ember itself is still shipped as a single distributed bundle, so we need it to be like a more real add-on. So that's like one of the next major phases of things. So that way we can strip it, like if you don't use XYZ computed macro or something, we can strip it. But I guess the short answer is progress is happening. It is very important. Yes.
How would someone start using Octane?
How would you? Okay, so most of the things that I talked about, with the exception of the file layout, are all just things that you can do already in a number 3.7 app. Angle bracket invocation, element modifier. Well, sorry, element modifiers are 3.8 unless you use polyfill, then it goes back to 2.10. But so you can basically use those things, and that's what I would probably do. Like I would just default to angle bracket invocation. There's a template rule that lets you enforce it. There's also a template rule that lets you enforce the using of this dot instead of curly post or something. There's a rule that let you enforce the angle bracket invocation as well. So the only thing that is slightly trickier to uptake is the file layout, and that's mostly so that there's an Octane blueprint, and it does generate an app, and it does build, and it does work, like simple hello world functions. The issue is mostly with interop with other downstream add-ons and the expectations those add-ons have. So, for example, an add-on may have a hook that's called, and it expects to find an app folder that just doesn't exist, so it throws an error. It's just not a super well-paid app. And that's part of what the edition is all about, is trying to say, this is where we're going, this is the direction, so folks can understand what needs to happen in the add-ons and the ecosystem across the way. We will, and I didn't talk about this, but we will almost certainly have some sort of preview of the edition before it's final. And the point of the preview or the preview process, maybe there's more than one preview, I don't know. The point of it is to let people experiment with it, let people make it better, and not like various add-ons work well or rejigger things and fix things. Is that answer? Yes.
Can you give an update on Ember engines?
Yep, still a thing. So not a lot of work, not a lot of changes have happened in engines over a while. The next large set of work, well, there's two things. One thing in the fire now, and the next one is sort of on deck. The first thing is some work that folks are doing to help prevent duplication and dependencies across engine boundaries, which is a pretty big pain point. There's lots of shenanigans that we do in my large work app that uses engines around like manually optimizing for bundle size or not or whatever. It's a lot of manual shenanigans that almost always results in worse code and worse structure, but like better bundle size. Which I understand that's important. Like I'm not saying that they're making a poor choice. It's just you're choosing tech debt intentionally to optimize for production speed, and that's a thing you can do, but it sucks. I don't want people to have to make that choice. So the first thing is helping to identify the duplication and reduce duplication and control it. So today, what happens in Ember CLI, unrelated to engines, if you have two versions of the same add-on, so say you have Ember Modal Dialog 1 and Ember Modal Dialog 2, and they're both in various levels of dependencies of something, Ember CLI is going to merge the files of each of them together into a single directory and ship the combined result as the version you get. And the one that's on the right, so the rightmost one wins, if you will, and the one that's on the right is the one that is the deepest and the lowest alphabetical sort order. So, yeah. By the way, I wrote that code. That's my fault. It has worked well enough, air quotes, for many years, but it is not a good situation. So the first thing is trying to prevent that from happening. In the cases where duplicates are okay, there are cases where duplicates are okay. In those cases, we should be able to scope consumers to the major, pretend like you prefix an @1, @2 in a major version or something in the moduling. That would work, right? So that's fine for the cases where you want duplication. The other case is what you want is you want a hard error when you introduce it so you don't make it worse. And so those things are sort of being kicked around and tried to work on. There is an add-on you can use today that does some of the work for you called Ember.js dependency lint. And that add-on does a great job. It'll fail your build if you introduce this sort of dependency situation. But it's unfortunate that it's not included by default, and that's where we're trying to make it better. So the second thing is that to do the thing that engines want, so there's a number of reasons you'd use engines today. If the reason is you want lazy loaded bundles, you have made the poor choice. So it's not that it's wrong, it's just that's not, you shouldn't have to suffer in your project structure and organization structure in order to get lazy loaded bundles, right? You should, if we want lazy loaded bundles, we should just have like actual bundled loader and do the right thing in the build pipeline. But to do that, you need whole program knowledge. You need something at the end stage that sees all the modules and decides who needs access to what and can properly figure out what assets you need to build. And that's the sort of end run around the whole problem. Now, engines don't go away in that case. It's just using engines for specifically getting this lazy loading behavior. That the other case for engines, and I think is still a great case, is organizationally if you want to have separate silos in your organization where individual parts are intentionally isolated from each other. Engines are great for that, and that was their original purpose. That was the goal of to have isolation. In a number of cases of apps that I have to deal with and maintain, the isolation is intentionally circumvented by injecting every service from the host into every engine to like completely obliterate any sort of isolation and just leverage the loading stuff. So, anyways, I don't know that I answered it well, but yeah. I don't have any wrapping paper. All right, that's it.